Sandra Osei had been called a burden on a Thursday and had received a phone call on a Monday that she had answered with the exact grace and composure and deliberateness of a woman who had spent 4 days deciding what kind of person she was going to be. About it, she was going to be the kind of person who answered the phone. The Thursday had been Thanksgiving 2022. The Monday had been November 28th. The phone call on the Monday had been from her daughter Naomi, 41 years old, senior marketing director at a firm in Atlanta, calling from her car at 11:30 in the morning to say that she had been let go from her position that morning and that she did not know what to do and that she was sorry for Thanksgiving, for the word, for the way she had said it, for the 4 days of silence between Thursday and Monday. Sandra had answered. She had listened. She had said, "Come over." Naomi had come. Sandra had made tea. They had sat at the kitchen table in the way they had sat at kitchen tables throughout all of Naomi's 41 years. And the first hour had been primarily crying on Naomi's part, and Sandra holding tea with both hands and saying very little, which was its own form of mothering, the kind that doesn't fix, that simply stays. Naomi had said, "I didn't mean it the way it came out." Sandra had said, "Tell me how you meant it." Naomi had said, "I was overwhelmed. I have 2 children and a mortgage and a husband who is also overwhelmed, and we were all in my kitchen on Thanksgiving, and I felt like everything was too much and I said the wrong thing." Sandra had said, "You said the thing you were feeling." Naomi had said, "Yes." Sandra had said, "And how does that feel to you now?" Naomi had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, "Like I said something I can't take back to the person who deserves it least." Sandra had nodded. She had refilled the tea. She had not told anyone what had happened at Thanksgiving. She had told her friend Vera the Monday evening after Naomi left, not as a complaint, but as a processing. She had said, "My daughter called me a burden," she had said, and then she came to me when she had nowhere else to go. Vera had said, "What did you do?" Sandra had said, "I made tea." Vera had looked at her for a long time. Vera had said, "Sandra, you know that is not normal, right? What you just did is not normal." Sandra had said, "It is for me." Vera had said, "That's the problem." She had thought about that conversation for 3 months before she walked onto the Family Feud stage. Sandra had raised Naomi and her younger brother Kwame alone following her husband's passing in 2001, when Naomi was 19 and Kwame was 16. She had been 52 when he died, old enough to have built a life, young enough to have many years left in it, and experienced enough to understand that the years were going to have to be managed carefully. She had managed them carefully. She had worked as a librarian for 28 years. She had kept the family house. She had been present for every milestone in both children's lives with the full, reliable presence that had defined her entire motherhood. She had never needed anything from Naomi that Naomi had not been able to give. She had designed her life that way, not to be a burden, which was the specific word she had spent her entire adult life making sure did not apply to her. She had been self-sufficient as a point of pride, as a gift to her children, as a daily demonstration that the people who love you should not have to worry about you. She had been not a burden so completely and for so long that she had never allowed herself to consider what the avoidance of burden was costing her. The Thanksgiving table had been full of that cost. Naomi had been hosting, her house, her kitchen, her children underfoot, her husband managing his own stress, Sandra helping in the kitchen because Sandra always helped in the kitchen, one of Sandra's grandchildren spilling something and Sandra cleaning it up while Naomi was trying to finish the green beans and the stuffing and the timing was all wrong. And Naomi had said, under her breath, but not quietly enough, "Mom, I can't have you underfoot right now. You're making it harder." And then worse. When Sandra had stepped back to the edge of the kitchen, Naomi had said, "Honestly, sometimes you're just a burden." She had said it to the green beans. She had not looked up. She had not intended it as a declaration. It had arrived in the room the way things arrive when they are said out loud for the first time, with the specific weight of a thought that has been thought many times finally leaving the body. Sandra had stood at the edge of the kitchen. She had said, "I'll go wait in the dining room." She had gone. They had eaten Thanksgiving dinner. They had not discussed it. Everyone had gone home. Sandra had driven herself home and sat in her own kitchen and thought about the word. But nobody in that studio knew that the woman who arrived with the warmest presence in the building had been called a burden 4 months ago and had answered the phone anyway. Sandra had come to Family Feud with Vera, her son Kwame, Kwame's wife Patricia, and a woman from her library named Dorcas, who had known Sandra for 16 years and who had, upon hearing the Thanksgiving story, said, "We are going to that show, and you are going to stand on that stage and be entirely visible, and we are going to win." Steve Harvey introduced the team and got to Sandra and asked what she did. Librarian, 28 years. He said librarians were the most undervalued professionals in American life, and he meant every syllable. She laughed. He asked what the best part of being a librarian was. She said, "Giving people the thing they need before they know they need it. You watch them come in with the wrong question, and you quietly help them find the right one." Steve tilted his head. "Have you ever needed someone to do that for you?" She looked at Vera. Vera looked at her with an expression that said, "This is exactly the moment." And Sandra told him. She told him about the green beans in the edge of the kitchen and the word. She told it plainly, without drama, with the same quiet precision she used to locate the right book for the wrong question. She described the 4 days between Thursday and Monday. She described answering the phone. She described making tea. She said, "I have spent my entire adult life making sure I was not a burden. I have been so successful at this that my daughter had the word in her head and I didn't know it was there." She said, "And I don't know how to feel about that. Whether I built something wrong or whether the word was always going to come out eventually. I am still figuring out which." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey had gone completely still. He looked at Sandra for a long time. "The word was always going to come out," he said carefully, "because you were so good at not being a burden that there was no space for her to see what you were actually carrying. And so when she was overwhelmed, she named you for the pressure instead of naming herself for the feeling." He stopped. "You gave her the word by never admitting you had needs." Sandra looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I believe that's right." 300 people did not breathe. "Stop everything," Steve said. He turned off stage. "We are stopping this game. This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show." He walked Sandra forward and sat beside her and said, "What do you need? Not for Naomi. What do you need?" She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "I need permission to have needs. I have been managing everything alone for so long that I genuinely do not know what it feels like to want something and ask for it. I need someone to tell me that asking is allowed." Steve said, "Asking is allowed. I'm telling you right now." The audience was quiet in a way it hadn't been all episode. He pulled out his phone. He called a therapist his foundation worked with who specialized in caregiver identity and self-erasure, live, speaker on. He explained the situation in 3 sentences. The therapist said, "What you are describing is a woman who has conflated love with self-removal." She said, This is one of the most common and least discussed presentations I see in women who have been primary caregivers for decades. She said, "Sandra, if you are hearing this, I want to work with you." Steve arranged 10 fully funded sessions covering both Sandra alone and Sandra and Naomi together. But Steve wasn't done. He held up his hand. He turned to the competing family, the Williams family from Savannah, and their youngest member, a woman named Iris, who was 38 years old, who crossed the stage immediately and stood in front of Sandra and said, "My mother never asked for anything either. I am calling her tonight. I want you to know that." Both families received the $25,000 prize. Steve Harvey looked at Sandra Osei and into the camera and said 5 words. "Asking is always allowed. Always." He said it with the full weight of a man who had been the person who didn't ask, and then spent decades making sure other people knew they could. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, Steve's sentence, "You gave her the word by never admitting you had needs," became one of the most cited lines in the show's history outside of traditional viral moments. Therapists, family counselors, and caregiving advocacy communities shared it. It reached 245 million views in 9 days. The hashtag #AskingIsAllowed was used by caregivers, adult children of self-erasing parents, and therapists working with caregiver identity dissolution. 3 months after the taping, Sandra began weekly sessions with the therapist Steve had called. She has said publicly that the first session she cried for 40 minutes about nothing specific, which the therapist said was exactly right. She has said that she is learning, slowly, to present herself as a person with requirements. She says it feels foreign and occasionally wonderful. 6 months after the taping, Sandra told Naomi she needed a ride to a medical appointment. This was the first time she had asked Naomi for something specific. Naomi arrived 20 minutes early and brought coffee. She did not say anything about the early arrival. She just handed Sandra the coffee. Sandra said, "Thank you." Naomi said, "I'm your daughter. This is allowed." A year after the taping, the Sandra Initiative, established through Steve Harvey's foundation, provides therapeutic support specifically for long-term primary caregivers navigating identity and self-erasure following the active caregiving period. In its first year, more than 700 individuals were served. Its founding principle, love is not the same as self-removal. Today, Sandra Osei asks for things. Not always, not dramatically. But sometimes, when she needs a ride or a favor or simply a phone call, she asks, and her children answer. The asking, she says, is the hardest and most important thing she has learned in her 70s. She says her late husband would have laughed and been proud simultaneously. She thinks that is exactly right. Have you ever been so careful not to be a burden that you erased yourself? Have you ever chosen yourself when it meant admitting you had needs? Share your story in the comments. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs permission to ask. Ring that notification bell for more stories of people who finally said what they needed.